Hi, Jeremy Morgan here. Today we're going to do something kind of silly, but educational. We're going to build a QR code generator. Okay, sure, we've all seen those, but we're going to do it with an Azure function. This will be a web app with an API that turns text into a QR code in PNG format. It will have an HTML and JavaScript front end on it and be fully contained. Just a single Azure function doing it all. No database, no static site hosting, just one function. You can find a detailed tutorial for this on All Hands on Tech. The link is in the description of this video as well as the source code. So let's jump in. Okay, so I'm here at my desktop. Now I've got all the things installed that I need installed to do this. You can get a full list right here at allhandsontech.com. I have the link to the article in the description of this video. And these are the requirements that you'll need to build this. You'll need a Microsoft Azure account, .NET 6, the Azure Function core tools, Azure CLI tools, and then some sort of editor. I'm using Visual Studio Code. It makes life easier. Now, just a note that you can do this with Visual Studio. In fact, there's a lot fewer steps. It's a lot better integrated. It's a lot of like wizards and click-throughs and you're done. However, the reason I chose to do it this way is for the folks out there who are using Mac OS X or Linux or something like that. I wanted to do it all through the CLI so that anybody can follow along and build this project. So I'm going to be using the Azure Functions core tools to start a new function. Now, Azure Functions are pretty unique, and we'll talk about those more as we go through this video, what they are, what they're meant for. They're not really meant for what I'm doing right now, but they're meant for small little pieces of code, and so they're scaffolded out a little bit differently. They're basically a function, like think of a method that's pushed into the cloud and run as a service. It's pretty cool. So what I'm going to do is use the Azure Functions core tools to scaffold out the new application. So I'm going to type in funcinit QR code gen, which is what I'm going to name this application. And then I need to specify the worker runtime. Now what this does is it basically creates the function, it scaffolds it out, and since I specified worker runtime.net, then it knows it's a C# application. You can do Azure Functions in a lot of different languages. We're doing this one in C# today. Okay, so I see my VS Code file, host.json, local settings JSON, and my CS proj file. Awesome. There are a lot of types of Azure Functions out there. Tons of them. What I'm going to do is create an HTTP trigger. HTTP trigger is a function that is just like it sounds. It's triggered by an HTTP call. So that's why we use it kind of as a API in a way. You can make REST calls towards these Azure functions, and they perform just like a miniature API without the server and IIS and all that other stuff. So we're going to use func again. Okay, now what I just typed in here is func new, and then I'm specifying a template. We're going to use the HTTP trigger template. And the name of it's going to be QR code gen, and authorization level is anonymous. That means anybody can hit this. You don't have to be authenticated or authorized in any way, and this will create our function. All right, successfully created. So let's crack open Visual Studio Code and take a look at it. Yes, I trust the authors, mostly. Okay, and as you can see, I have some things popping up here in my Visual Studio Code screen, so I will install the Azure Functions plugin. This is a brand new machine install, by the way, so there's going to be a few things like this. You might experience this as well. That's why I'm leaving it in the video. Okay, and we are good to go. So we have a host JSON. This is going to be used once it's out there in the cloud. We're not really going to mess with it today. We've got a local settings JSON, and this is for running it locally, which we're going to do. And then we have our function. And here it's qrcodegen.cs. As we can see, public static async. It responds with an iAction result. You pass some things in here, runs, goes. Let's just take a look at see what it looks like. So if I type in func start, this function will start up locally. I'm going to allow access through the firewall. And as I can see here, I have one function called QR code gen. It accepts get or a post. This is the URL or URI. And let's go ahead and load it up. All right, so we've loaded it up here. And it says this HTTP trigger function executed successfully. Pass in a name in the query string or in the request body for a personalized response. Awesome. Let's do that. We need to figure out how. Now, if we look at here, it says string name equals request or REQ. It's an HTTP request that we passed in up here of name. So I'll just put in a name as a parameter. Hello, Jeremy. This HTTP triggered function was executed successfully. Awesome. So this is the model that we're going to use. This is a very simple model. I'll drag this over here. And I'll just kind of explain really quickly how this function works. So you have an HTTP trigger. Now, when we pass in, we're creating this run method here, and we pass in an HTTP trigger, and then we have parameters for that trigger. So we have the authorization level, which is anonymous. We set that earlier. We accept get and post requests to this. Our route equals no. Now, route is, we'll find it here. This is our route, /API/QR code gen. Now, we can, because the function name is QR code gen, it's automatically generated, but we can create custom routes here. We're not going to do that today, but just know that it's a possibility. Then we pass in the HTTP request. That way we can pull things from that request, such as query parameter of name, right? And then we pass in an ilogger of log. So that's how we log this information right here. Now it goes down here. We'll just step through this line by line. I'll be as quick as possible. So we have the log information. It says it processed a request. Then we create a variable named name. We grab that request query parameter of name. Then here we have string request body. So what this does is it reads the body. So if this was sent in as a post, we would read the body of that request. And this comes out of request.body. We read it to the end, and then we have this, which is dynamic data, JSON convert deserialize objects. So if somebody sends in JSON, we can deserialize that JSON and use that in a post. We're not going to do that today, but again, know that it's a possibility, something you can do. And then we have this fancy thing that says, if we don't have name, maybe look in data name for it, or maybe name isn't going to exist at all. It's a possibility. So that's where the next one comes in. We have a response message, and it says if the string is null or empty name, then we'll tell the people to put in a name. If there is a name, it's not null or empty, then it's going to say, hello, name. This triggered successfully. That's what we demonstrated earlier. And then we just return a new OK object result with our response message, which is just a string, and voila. So that's the line by line part of it. And we're going to delete all of this. So we're going to start all over again with this fun project, the QR code generator. Okay, now the next thing we need to do is we'll shut down our function. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add the package for the QR code generator. Now this is a QR code generator that generally runs on a desktop. It's not really one that runs in the cloud. Well, it does run in the cloud, but it's not really designed to run. It's more designed for a desktop. I see this used a lot with WPF applications and things like that, but it can be used, and that's what we're going to show today, it can be used in the cloud, in a web app. The next one is Skia Sharp, I think it's pronounced. Now this one, what it does is it takes, so the code creep package will spit out an SVG or byte array or something like that. We need to put it into a byte array specifically for PNGs. Now in order to do that, we need this Skia Sharp. Another thing that you need Skia Sharp for is if you're planning on doing it outside of Windows. So the QR code generator library works fantastic in Windows, not so much in Linux and Mac. So if you add the Skia Sharp, then it's an extension, and you can use it on all the platforms, and you can generate PNGs, which is what we're going to do here. So there we go. Now we've got to download a file to our project, and I'll bring this file up here. And once again, if you want this full URL, it's going to be in the article that I've linked in the description. So we need to take this. So I'm going to create this file name here. Okay, now we've got a CS file here. I'm going to go back, and I'm just going to take the raw text from here, copy it, paste it. Simple. Now the extensions are here, and it's a part of the program. Now we need to create a function. We deleted the other one here, so we're going to have to create this one from scratch. And we're going to name this one Generate QR Code. It's a little bit better name than what I came up with earlier, right? So that's going to be the name of our function. There's our decorator. And what that's going to do is that'll append that on the end of the URL. Okay, now we've created our method. Once again, we're returning a task with an iAction result in it. Generate is going to be the name, and we're passing in some info to the HTTP trigger. So this is pretty much the same as the last function that we had, the default one. Now, we need to grab from the query string, similar to what that name did earlier. We need to do that. So this, our HTTP request is passed in here. We're going to go ahead and snag that QR text, if it exists on there, and we're going to use it. And here I put in a log information, just to say generating QR code for BLAP. And we'll just use that so that we can watch the console and make sure that that text is being read and it's doing what we think it should do. Now we need to make a call to that static QR code library that we installed earlier. And we will add, as you can say, using node cat create, okay. Now, what this is doing is it's creating a QR code out of this text. So we know that we have QR text, or at least we assume that we have QR text. So we're going to pass that into encode text. And then here is the error correction model. So there are 4 different levels of error correction for QR codes. And medium, I think, is pretty good for us. The bigger they get, the smaller the dots get and the more dense it gets. And basically what that's designed for is if you have a QR code that's on a sticker somewhere that's going to get scratched or it's going to get hydraulic oil on it or something, it does its own self-error correcting. So we're just going to choose medium for now. Now we need to create a PNG out of this. So that's where we're going to call in that extension from the Skia Sharp that we had earlier. Okay, and here we have PNG out, which is our variable. And we're just basically saying QR, which is that object we created earlier where we encoded text, to PNG. 10 is the scale. So I played around with the scale a little bit, and I found one that kind of fits in the web page pretty nice. And then 1 is the border. So we put a small little border over it. And then we have our foreground color, which is Skia Sharp SK Colors Black. And Skia Sharp's actually a part of the .NET framework. So you do have these colors here, and there's tons of colors, but we're just going to do black and white. So we got black for the foreground, white for the background. Should be great. This will give us a PNG. And next we need to create a JSON return object. So what I'm going to do is just use a POCO for this. Plain old class object. We're going to take that, super simple. We're going to convert it into JSON and kick it out the door with our PNG in it. Now, how are we going to send the PNG as JSON? Well, we're just going to base64 encode it. There's probably a few different ways you could do this, especially if you're using blob storage or something. You could use a reference to this, like generate the PNG, upload it to the server, put a reference to it. Probably the best way to do it. However, we're trying to keep this extremely simple. So I'm just generating a QR code, turning it into a PNG, base64 encoding it as this giant string and kicking it out the door. So that's how we're going to do it. So here's our super complicated object. We have a public class of return object. It has a string of image, named image as the property. So this is just literally a class with a string in it. And we'll go ahead and create that. So I've created a new return object. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to populate that image property with our PNG, base64 encoded. So we'll say convert to base64 string, PNG out. Now we just need to return that JSON result. So now we're returning a new JSON result, our result. If you've used web APIs, ASP.NET Web API, anything like that, this should look very familiar to you. So this is our entire operation. This is the QR text is being read in, it's converted to a QR code, turned into a PNG, and streamed out the door. So let's run it and test it. Okay, so we'll go back here and say func start. And there we go. And it is not Maltese. But as you can see, our function worked as expected. Make this a little bit bigger. So we passed in the QR text of hello world, and now we've got a JSON file that only contains an image, and this is the base64 encoded PNG that we created. So that's perfect. Now what we need to do is put a front end on it. Now what I'm going to do is create a folder here called www, and I'm going to create an index file in that folder. Now if we were building a real application, I'd use like static web apps or Netlify or something, anything. But here we want this to be all contained in this one Azure function as a part of the constraints of this project. So what I'm going to do is create an index HTML that's going to provide a front end for that QR code generator, and we're just going to push that HTML out the door. So I'll put in a header. And here we have an input box, and this is where the user is going to put in a text string or URL or whatever. We have a button that's going to call getQRCode, which is a JavaScript function. And here's our getQRCode function, and this just makes a basic XML HTTP request. It's going to call back into itself. It's going to take this input box text, whatever's in this text, and it's going to throw it at the API, and then that's going to come back, and we're going to take whatever the API spits back and put it into an image. As you can see here, we have the image tag, source equals data image / PNG base64, and then we're going to push in our base64 stream. So that should render a nice little image on our page. This is it's very crude, but very simple, and it works. Close out these tags. And that's our index file. Now, in order to serve it up, we're going to have to create another function within our Azure function. So we'll go up here. Okay, now for this one, I'm creating a HTTP response message this time. So the other one returns an iAction result as a part of the API. This is the front end part. We're just going to return an HTTP response message that's stuffed with the HTML from the index HTML that we have locally. Another difference you might notice here is we have execution context. Now, the reason I'm passing in the execution context is because I don't want to hard code the path to that index HTML. I don't even want it to be a relative path. I want to get it from the execution context. So wherever this Azure function is living somewhere out there in the cloud, I want to be able to grab that context and say, okay, this is inside the www folder of our context, wherever we're living at this time. Now here's something I noticed, and I'm going to leave the mistake in the video, just to show you that we all make mistakes. I started creating this within the namespace, and it needs to be created within the class. It's pretty basic, but I missed it. Okay, now we're in a good spot. Now I've got string index page, and what this does is it just does a file, read all text, www index.html. So wherever the heck it is, it's going to grab it, pull it in. Okay, so now we have string index page, and what that's going to do is just do a file.readAllText, so it's going to read all the text in a file of this index.html. And you can see here that I'm using context function app directory. So wherever the app directory is, wherever it is on the cloud, we'll grab the index.html inside the www folder. And next we're going to create a result, and we're going to create a new HTTP response message of OK, or 200. And as you can see, this is one of the reasons I'm using Visual Studio Code, is because I don't actually remember where all these namespaces are a lot of the time. So we'll just say using system.net. There we go. And so this result is going to be a 200 OK. But if we just send this text out in a stream, it's going to be read as a text file by the browser. It's not going to render any of the HTML or JavaScript. To do that, we need to add a header to this response message. And here we're adding text HTML as the header. And once again, using system HTTP headers. And then we have the body. Now we know the content in a HTTP response message is a byte array. So what we're doing here is saying result content is a new byte array content, and we're going to encode it with UTF-8 index page, which is that big pile of text that we pulled out of the index page file. Now this might seem crazy and silly and odd, but it'll work, I promise. And now we're just returning that result. We're returning the response. It's going to come up. Life will be good. Now one thing you might notice is I've got some squiggly lines down here. This is not an async method. However, it's supposed to be. But since this is generally synchronous, see, I had to make a call. This is an async method, and it needs to be an async method in order for the Azure function to work. However, if I were to put this into a task and things like that, it would make it overly complicated, so I just kept it as a synchronous method. Anyway, it's a synchronous method, but it's stuffed into an async, and it's not that big of a deal. If you're building this for real, you would want to make this probably async. Okay, now since we know that I have this index.html, this needs to be included. If we try to run this right now, the first thing it's going to do is say, I can't find www.index.html because it won't be in the bin directory. And that's what we need to change here. So we'll go into the CS proj, and we're just going to copy this into the output directory. So now every time this function builds or runs, it will copy that www/index.html into the bin directory where it can be accessed. And that's great because if you do any modifications to that index.html, you put some styles on it, whatever, then the next time you build it, it'll update. All right, shall we see if it works? So we'll type in func start. Now you might notice a difference here. Now we have two different functions listed. So we have the form, which is the JavaScript form that we're going to serve up. And then we have generate QR code, which is the API that returns it. So we should be able to snag this form. Voila. There's a nice little JavaScript front end for us. We'll type in hello world. And there's a QR code. Ta-da! Very cool, right? And we can change this up. Do HTTPS allhandsontech.com. Create QR code. And I'll take my little QR code reader here. And there it is. Probably a little hard to see, but it's allhandsontech.com. Feel free to pause it and scan if you'd like to verify it. There we go. Now we've got it running locally. Everything's good. Let's go ahead and uncomment that, that file here. We'll shut down the function. We'll comment this out and put for local testing. We'll uncomment this. And now we're ready to push this up to Azure. All right, so I'm in my Azure portal here, and I've got a couple Azure functions in here that I play around with. We're going to create a new one. I'm going to put this under Visual Studio. You select your resource group here. I'm going to put this under demos. And now I'll need to come up with a function app name. And this has to be unique across all of Azure. So QR code, not available. How about QR code generator? Also not available. QR code gen is available. So we just want to run this as code. And we'll select our runtime stack, which is going to be .NET 6. And we can run this on Linux or Windows, but we're going to run it on Windows. And so we have our models here. We have the consumption model or functions premium. Obviously, we don't want to use functions premium and spend a bunch of money on this, so we're just going with the consumption model. And here it will ask for a storage account. So we'll create a new one. And then we can go to review and create. And this is really all we have to do on the Azure side. All right, and we'll wait for our deployment to complete. Now, one of the things I'll need to do is log into Azure from the Azure CLI. So I'll type in Azure login, type in AZ login. And it'll want me to pick an account. We'll pick this one. Boom. Now I'm logged in to Azure CLI. So to deploy this application, let's jump back in there. Deployment's complete. We'll use that func command again. And I'm going to say func Azure function app publish QR code gen, which I believe is what I named it. This is going to be the name on Azure. No zip. Now, one of the things that I'll point out here, we'll go through each of the parts of this command. So we have func, which is the core Azure function tools that we've been using. We specify Azure. We specify that this is a function app. We want to publish it. The name of the app on Azure, mind you, if you named it something different here, doesn't matter, it needs to be on Azure. And the no zip is, there's two different ways to do this. We can zip up this application and then just publish the zip file. And the zip file will extract and run. We're doing it without the zip file right now. That's something that's better done with like continuous integration, things like that. But we're just like writing code and pushing it up there. So we do it with no zip. And while it's uploading, you can sip ice water or whatever your drink of choice is. Okay, and our upload completed successfully. And there's our QR code generator. Except now it's not local, it's up on Azure. Hello world. And there's our QR code. Easy. So here's the URL of the article with a step-by-step tutorial for building this. And this is all there is to it. Thank you for following along with me. And I do have the source, all the source code is available on my GitHub. Thank you for following along while I do this crazy stuff. So thank you for sticking with me all this time. Azure Functions are awesome. So now I have a challenge for you. Take this project and add something to it. Maybe put in some exception handling, store the images for later, put a real front end on it. Put your own twist on this and add something cool. If you do, tag Pluralsight on Twitter or tag me, Jeremy C. Morgan. I'd love to see what you come up with. If you like this type of content, subscribe to this channel. We'll be doing a lot more of this kind of thing soon.